Well, g'day everyone. Hope you're doing well. Chad here coming to you from Medan in Indonesia. It's about half an hour's flight away from KL, where we were last weekend. Here ministering this weekend in a ministry school of a friend of ours who trains local pastors. We're also going into a village to do some healing evangelism and then finishing off our visit here with some ministry in some Christian churches on the Sunday before coming home. So I've done my best today to give you some kind of view, not the greatest view of Medan, but anyway, it's the best I could do from my hotel room here. Okay, so today this video is launching our 14th week, congratulations, in our Chronological Bible Reading Plan. We are supposed to be finishing off the book of Judges this week. We're reading the book of Ruth. Only 4 chapters, very easy. And then starting the book of Samuel. Okay, so this video today, essentially, I'll just talk about Judges and Ruth. Last week, I talked exclusively on Joshua. This week, I'll talk about Judges and Ruth. In the big picture scheme of things, Judges and Ruth draws the bridge, okay, between the death of Joshua, Moses and the Joshua generation, and it bridges that gap between there and the onset of the monarchy. Okay, how did Israel become a kingdom? Israel was one man who became one family, who became one nation under Moses, who was 12 tribes scattered throughout the promised land in the era of Joshua. That one nation will become one kingdom, and Judges and Ruth bridges that gap. It basically is the Bible's way of describing what life was like. What was Israel like after they had no national leader? Because remember, Moses, a national leader. Handed over to Joshua, a national leader. When Joshua dies, he does not appoint a national successor. Okay, that's significant. He doesn't appoint a national successor. Each tribe is left essentially to their own devices. And so what the Judges and Ruth describe what life was like when they did not have a national leader in the days before they have a king. Okay, so these are bridging books that bridge the gap there. And essentially the message of these books, and we find this particularly at the end of Judges, is that Israel doesn't do too well, okay? When they're left to their own devices, when they don't have a national leader, Israel did not do too well in this period. And without spoiling it from you, the way that they start in the book of Judges and the way they finish, they end up worse than how they started, because having a national leader, while it was God's will for them, they did not cooperate very well with that sort of system of leadership. And so what you see in Judges is this constant cycle of God's people. They rebel against God. They follow the cultures of the peoples around them, which they were not supposed to do. They do not follow God's law, okay? Because of that, God hands them over to their enemies. Because of that, they cry out for help. Because of that, God anoints a spiritual leader, a prophet, a judge, a military leader who leads them into deliverance. And so that cycle is repeated again and again and again. And unlike Moses and Joshua, remember, these judges weren't national leaders. They popped up in different locales. They popped up in different locations for a specific task to release God's people at a specific point in history. And as we read through the book of Judges, we'll find that there are actually 12 judges in this book. What a coincidence, okay? This key Hebrew number, which incidentally is kind of a shadow of what we see in the first century in the New Testament. Jesus' name in the Hebrew is Joshua. And when Jesus leaves the planet, what does he do? He hands over responsibility of leading God's people to 12 apostles. In the same way, this book, the Acts of the Judges, if you like, in the Hebrew, it's the Hebrew equivalent of the book of Acts, okay, describes the acts of these 12 judges after Joshua's left. Anyway, that's just a bit of a theory of mine. You can take it or leave it. So enjoy Judges this week. It's quite an easy read. It is, again, narrative book with kind of a feeling of legend to it. I mean, these are definitely historical characters, but the way that they're written about, particularly the 6 major ones, they're kind of like the Avengers of Israel's history, okay? These are superheroes that come along to deliver God's people. And so while it is historical narrative, the feeling it has is written almost like tales of legend. And you'll see that in the way that many of the numbers of the era, the periods of time that they ruled, or the numbers of children that they have, are all rounded up into multiples of 30 or 40, and it just kind of adds that feeling of like a legend feel to it. That's kind of the best I can explain it. Anyway, enjoy the Book of Judges. The main point of the Book of Judges, because that's my job in these tutorials, the main point of the Book of Judges is to draw the link between the Joshua generation and the onset of the monarchy, which comes about in the book of Samuel. So that's the main point. The main point is to show what life in Israel was like when they had no king. Okay, it was the wild, wild west of Israel's history. And as I said before, sadly, the moral state of Israel gets worse and worse and worse over time, which is kind of the author's way of saying that having a monarchy ended up being necessary to once more have a national leader to join God's people together. All right, so that's the book of Judges. In Ruth, what we see is a story of a real-life character, again, that is almost like a beautiful Hebrew short story. And listen, you have to read Ruth in one sitting, okay? I insist. It is 4 chapters, but please don't read it, one chapter here, one chapter there. Sit down and read Ruth in one sitting. You can do it really easily in about 20 to 30 minutes, but it's a great little book. It's got an introduction at the start, a conclusion at the end, with 4 kind of key events that happen in between. And those who understand Hebrew tell us that the introduction is 71 words, the conclusion is 71 words, and in between we have this beautiful story. So apparently it's a great Hebrew short story that's a bit of a classic, okay, the story of Ruth. So sit down in one reading and to read it. The basics of the book of Ruth is in the opening verses and introduction. We're introduced to 3 key characters, a gentleman by the name of Elimelech, and his name means God is king. And what does he do? In the opening verses, he dies. Okay, again, it's this prophetic picture of what God's people were like when they did not acknowledge God as king. That was what was happening in this era. Okay, so Elimelech dies, and his widow, her name is Naomi, who is now in the land of the Moabites where they were living at the time, and her 2 sons also die. So Naomi is left with her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law, and one of them is called Ruth, after whom this book is written. They head back to Bethlehem, where her deceased husband's family were from, and it is there that Ruth ends up marrying a gentleman by the name of Boaz. Under Hebrew law, in Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 25, easy to remember, there was this principle called a kinsman redeemer, where if someone was a widow, okay, the closest relative, the brother, was to marry her if she did not have children, to give her an heir, to make sure that family kept prosperous. And Boaz ends up being that man who also buys their property. Anyway, you can read about the story. The main point at the end of the day is that Boaz marries Ruth, okay? It is often repeated that she is a Moabite. She is outside of a Hebrew lineage until, of course, Boaz marries her, okay? But the point of this book is to show where King David came from. Because right at the end of this book, it shows that this man, Boaz, who married Ruth, their son becomes King David's grandfather. Okay? So the idea of the book of Ruth, remember I said both Judges and Ruth, is to bridge the gap. What happened in that time between the Joshua generation, Moses and Joshua, and the onset of the kingdom? Well, Ruth does that in a beautiful way. It's a little story somewhere in this period of time that shows where King David's lineage was from, which is interesting, of course, because King David is not the first king that is appointed, as we'll see next week in the book of Samuel. She is an incredible character, the book of Ruth, and she ends up being one of the women, just one of them, but one of the women that is named ultimately in the lineage of Jesus, because of course King David's line is where Jesus comes from. So enjoy Judges and enjoy Ruth this week. You'll start the book of Samuel as well, where we're introduced to Samuel, who ends up being Israel's last judge. And he ends up being, is a prophet and a judge, like many of them were, and he ends up being the one who is responsible for transitioning Israel from the age of the judges to the age of the kingdom and the age of the monarchy. And so we're introduced to Samuel, a really key figure. In fact, get this, I only just thought of this. If the 12 judges in the book of Judges are equivalent to the 12 apostles in the New Testament, I wonder if somehow Samuel, the 13th guy, is somehow a picture of the Apostle Paul. I don't know. You can take that or leave it. Anyway, enjoy these books this week, guys. I'm going to enjoy a busy weekend here, and I'll see you very soon on the other side. Enjoy Judges, Ruth, and start off with Samuel. Okay? Bless your heaps. Bye.